This is the King Chasing Podcast, where we keep Christ at the center of athletics. Here's your host, Brandon Gilmore.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Brandon, and this is the King Chasing Podcast. As always, thanks for joining us, and please make sure to visit our website at theNCCAA.org for more King Chasing content. Well, I'm really excited about our guest today, Jason Romano, the Director of Media at Sports Spectrum and host of the popular Sports Spectrum podcast. For 17 years, Jason was an Emmy-Award winning producer and senior manager at ESPN. He has created and produced content for shows such as SportsCenter, Monday Night Football, Mike and Mike in the Morning, Sunday NFL Countdown, College Gameday, NFL Live, Major League Baseball's All-Star Game, and more. He's also written 2 books titled Live to Forgive and his most recent titled The Uniform of Leadership. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jason. Well, hey, Jason, welcome to King Chasing. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy schedule. How are you doing today, sir?
Brandon, I'm good. I love the title, King Chasing. I think it's a great title for a podcast, and I'm honored to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you on here. There's a lot that I want our listeners to hear from you, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. You started working at ESPN in 2000 as a producer for ESPN Radio. In your book, The Uniform of Leadership, which we'll discuss a little more later, you mentioned it was your dream job. What were those first few months like? Did it take time getting used to being around all the big name personalities and all that? Just let us know what that was like.
So I'll preface this by saying, yes, it was a dream job, but to be honest with you, when I was kind of going through college and even growing up, it felt like it was beyond my dreams because, it's kind of like everybody dreams of being a Major League Baseball player. 99 point whatever percent don't become a Major League Baseball player, right? So it becomes a dream that you don't think is ever attainable, that you don't think you'll ever get to. So at some point, the dream goes to something more realistic, if you will, when you are in college and coming out of college. And so my realistic dream was to work in local television and be the anchor for the sportscast at night in probably my hometown of Albany, New York. But then the opportunity to go to ESPN happened. I interviewed, I got the job, and this reality of a dream job that I never thought I could have attained happened. And so I'll tell you a quick story. The first day I ever started, July 18th, 2000, I was super excited. They had put me up in a kind of a hotelish type of place for, it wasn't a hotel, but a couple housing, we'll say, for a couple weeks until I found my own place to live. And so I drive from Albany to Bristol, Connecticut, and it's my night before my first day. And I'm living in this place for a couple of weeks. So I have enough to kind of live in these quarters, but I don't want to move in per se. And I go and I unpack, and I like to set up what I'm going to wear the next day. That's just kind of how I'm wired. I don't like to kind of wake up and just let's figure out what we're going to do today. I like to prepare. And I go to get the clothes that I'm going to wear. And I was thinking about wearing like a nice pair of slacks and maybe a real nice button down, possibly even a tie. And I went and I had no nice clothes with me. The nicest pair of clothes I had was a pair of jeans, a golf shirt, and my sneakers. Now, the funny story of this goes, Brandon, is most people at ESPN wear that every day. They wear a golf shirt, jeans, and sneakers. Maybe you might wear a pair of slacks on a nice day and some nice shoes. But for the most part, that's the attire that people wear. But I didn't want to make my first day appearance be that way. And I felt so horrible walking in for my first day for orientation. And I'm literally dressed like, I'm about to go hit some golf balls or something. And thankfully, they were very forgiving. And they just said, listen, this is what people wear here. You're fine. But I felt terrible. But I was in awe. The way you asked it, just being around celebrities and being around, people who are pretty famous, it took a little while for me to adjust to that sort of world. it probably took a couple months. I mean, one of the first people I ever spent time with at ESPN who I would deem famous was a guy named Nate Newton, who was an offensive lineman with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan as a kid. And, well, I guess Mike Golick, too, would be another guy from Mike and Mike in the Morning. I started working on Mike and Mike my 4th day at ESPN Radio,
Wow.
I guess July 22nd or whatever it was. And I loved working on that show. It was in its early days, though, so it wasn't super popular. Not a lot of people knew who Mike Greenberg was back in 2000. Mike Golick was known as the football guy who played with the Eagles. And so I was around Golick a lot, and I was around Nate Newton a lot those first few months. And I remember each day I'd come in to work, and I'd be like, I can't believe I'm sitting here with Nate Newton and Mike Golick. By the way, Nate Newton blocked Mike Golick many times
Wow.
in these Cowboys-Eagles games. So it
Right.
was very weird for me. And again, they're not super famous athletes, but they're pretty well known. And for this guy who's a big sports junkie and myself. So I think what that did, though, is that helped humanize them a little bit for me. I've been around some celebrities when I worked in local radio and had a few moments here and there, but this helped humanize the guys that I looked up to and watched, growing up and even into my 20s. And it helped prepare me. What I didn't realize was that I was going to be around some pretty big name people for the next 17 years. And yes, there were moments where I could bask in that and just enjoy it and realize this is cool. Not a lot of people get to do this, but also remember that they're people. I can get to know them. I can talk to them about things that I maybe never thought I would talk to a celebrity or somebody that I idolized about, not just sports, but about deeper issues, certainly faith issues with some of the people. So that was an interesting and fun time for me, especially those early years where, I got to be honest with you, though, for 17 years, I kind of, did a little pinch myself each day when I walk in there. Now, it did start to wear off a little bit, but I never lost that sort of understanding that I was working at a place that millions of people would dream about working.
Yeah.
And I was being paid to talk about, to produce, and to watch sports.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to be upset when you're working in a job like that.
Sure.
And for a kid who made sports his entire life when he was, 10 years old until, probably in my 20s, this was the greatest thing I could have ever imagined. But then you realize it's work.
Right.
Too bad.
Right.
Like, oh, look at, I'll sit here and watch sports all day. No, there's actually skills and, things that you have to put into place to show that you know what you're doing and that you're good at what you're doing, and you have to do the work. And I think that was the part I think that was most challenging to me, was I never thought I was great at what I did, but I always wanted to be. And I knew I was around the greatest producers and hosts around. So I was watching and learning and trying to achieve and strive and be as good as I could be, because I was in the big leagues. Right? It's like a baseball player. When you get to the big leagues, you want to be the best that you can be. Not everybody is Shohei Ohtani or Pete Alonso or Aaron Judge, but if you get there, you want to be the best that you can be and contribute. And that's kind of how I approach the job.
You mentioned Nate Newton. Was he the player that that blocked kick that went and like scrummed on the football and lost that
No,
one?
that was Leon
That was
Lett.
Leon.
That was
Okay.
Leon Lett.
Okay.
Yeah. Who I've never met, by the way, but I've known many people who played with him.
Yeah.
In fact, the funny story goes that Leon Lett, on that play, it was against the Miami Dolphins on Thanksgiving in 93. Mike Golick was on the Dolphins. That was his last year and involved in that play. So I had long conversations with Mike Golick about that game in particular and about that play, which went in, unfortunately into the annals of blunders when you talk about the NFL.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. What's another one of your favorite memories while working at ESPN? You just shared some about starting off, but your long career there. What's one of your favorite memories?
So there's a bunch, obviously. There's so many wonderful memories, including just wonderful people that I got to spend time with. And then there's the memories of like 9/11, right? And remembering being at ESPN and working at ESPN as 9/11 was happening. And, some big moments of, like when George Steinbrenner passed away. I remember being at work that day with Pete Carroll, and taking him around ESPN as he was getting ready to become the new Seattle Seahawks head coach. So there's memories like that. But for me personally, as a kid growing up, my baseball hero was Darryl Strawberry. And, I was wearing the Darryl Strawberry jersey. I had Darryl Strawberry shirts. I had all his baseball cards. I had his poster that said Strawberry Patch or Strawberries Patch up on my wall. I'll never forget it. I had notebooks that I kept stats of him when he was playing, when I was a young teenager. So he was my hero and just my favorite player. And many years later, this is in the late 80s, many years later, in 2009, 9 years into my career at ESPN, and I find out that Darryl Strawberry has a new book out and that his publicist wants to bring him to ESPN to promote the book and to do a bunch of shows. And I was fortunate to be assigned that project, and I put together a schedule. Darryl comes to ESPN, and it was very interesting that at that time because Darryl came by himself. I spent hundreds and hundreds of days at ESPN with celebrities and athletes and coaches, and most of them bring someone or a bunch of people with them. In many cases, we even called it an entourage.
Right.
Darryl came by himself. So it was me and my hero for 8 hours spending time together at ESPN. This is May of 2009. And it still to this day is, I don't know if it's the greatest day I spent at ESPN, because I'd have to go through 17 years of history to think about that. But it's in the top 2 or 3, no doubt.
Yeah.
Because that day, as I mentioned earlier about getting to know and humanize some of these celebrities, that day became the beginning of a friendship that still 13 years later to this day takes place. And I expected to talk to Darryl Strawberry that day about the 1986 Mets and all the home runs he hit playing at Shea Stadium, what it was like to be, a hero on the baseball field. We didn't talk about any of that. For that day, we talked about faith. We talked about forgiveness. We talked about parenting, fatherhood, broken relationships. He had a broken relationship with his dad and some of his family. I had a broken relationship with my dad. He was involved in drugs and alcohol and really hit a rock bottom moment with addiction. My dad had the same thing. We talked about that. And we talked about, most importantly, we talked about Jesus and his faith. And he got my number that day, Brandon, which was just crazy that Darryl Strawberry asked you for his number. And he said, I'm going to stay in touch. I'm going to be praying for your dad.
Wow.
And that's easy for a celebrity to say and kind of move on with life.
Right.
Darryl did exactly what he said he was going to do every few months. And I was always afraid to stay in touch with him. Like, how do you call your hero and just say, hey, Darryl, checking in. How you doing, buddy?
Right.
It just felt weird to me to do that.
Yep.
Right. But every couple of months, my phone would ring, and I always, I put Darryl's number in my phone, and there it was, Darryl Strawberry calling. And I would show my wife, I'm like, look at who's calling on my phone. And she's like, well, you better answer that phone. So I answer it, and it's Darryl. And the first thing he would always say to me is, hey, Jason, good to hear from you, buddy. How's your dad doing? And for many years, I would tell him, he's still not doing great, Darryl. Could you pray for him? Absolutely, brother. And let's pray. And then we would talk a little bit. And then he'd say, okay, well, keep doing your thing. Keep your chin up and just checking on you. Love you, buddy. And he would hang up.
Wow.
First of all, that's insane, right? That your hero from when you were a little kid would do that. But that humanized Darryl in an amazing way that allowed us to stay in touch. We lost some connection towards the end of my ESPN career, leading into when I left ESPN. But then we reconnected in 2017 at a conference here in Connecticut that he was speaking at. And he remembered me. And the very first thing he said when he saw me, he gave me a big hug and he said, how's your dad doing?
Wow.
And I know we might get to this part, but I was able to tell him, hey, Darryl, my dad's doing actually better. And I always appreciated that you asked about him, because I was hoping that one day I'd be able to say those words. And today I'm able to say to you that he's doing much better. And I told him about the book that I wrote, Live to Forgive. And Daryl offered to, help out with the book in any way. And so I asked him if he would write the foreword to the book. And he said yes. And so his name and my name are on my very first book, which is just insanity even now, 4 years later since I released that book. And we've stayed in touch. And I saw him, I'm trying to remember the last time I saw him, maybe a year ago. We chat pretty frequently on text, and occasionally he'll still call me on the phone and just check in and make sure I'm doing okay. That's the real deal when you think about a person. And Daryl's been through hell and back, but he's on fire for the Lord to this day. He's a traveling evangelist, and all he does is wants to go around and tell people about Jesus. And anyone that wants to do that is a hero in my book, and it happens to be the hero that I rooted for like crazy as a kid when I was 12 years old. So,
man, that's so cool. So as a producer, you're kind of, when you're at ESPN, kind of a more behind the scenes kind of person. Is there a moment or a memory you have behind the scenes? Like, I just know, I helped produce our NCCA network and championships and things like that. And I know sometimes things are very chaotic, and I'm like, man, if the fans had any idea like what was going on right now, like, was there anything like that or anything
I
else?
got one. Yeah, there's a bunch of stories, because when you're a producer for 17 years, you have those moments, right, where everything goes crazy or something amazing just happened, and you're like, okay, how do we react to this? But I do remember I was fortunate in 2003 to go to the NCAA Final Four in New Orleans that year for the men's basketball championships. And we were covering the games, the Saturday games. I can't remember everybody that was in it, but I remember Kansas was in it. I remember Dwayne Wade was in it with Marquette, and Syracuse, maybe Texas, I think was the fourth team. And, watched those games from afar, and, did a few interviews post game in the locker room of the semifinals, which was fun, especially with Kansas. They had won, and we went in there and did a few interviews. I was working with a guy named Bob Valvano, who is Jim Valvano's brother. And Bobby V, as we called him, was a radio host at ESPN Radio. So he was the one that was assigned as the talent, and I was the producer. We were covering the Final Four. So when he finished with that, we went back Sunday and we started planning about what we were going to do on Monday night for the national championship. And it ended up being Syracuse and Kansas. This was Carmelo Anthony as a freshman, if you remember that year. And a lot of people still thought Kansas was going to win, but we were like, all right, we want to get an interview with the head coach. If it was Kansas, it was Roy Williams at the time, who then went on to North Carolina, of course. And for Syracuse, it's Jim Boeheim. So you got legends, right, that are coaching. And Bobby said, hey, I'm good with both of them. We're all set. And so I had to send a note to the SIDs of both schools, sports information directors, and let them know, hey, after the game on Monday, if you win, which was always hard to say because somebody's going to lose, we would like to have 5 minutes with the head coach, as we traditionally do with Bob Valvano. Both agreed. Both said yes, thankfully. And so we went to Monday night's game. And Monday night's game, it was kind of crazy. Syracuse had a big lead. Kansas came back, but Syracuse ultimately ended up winning. I think Hakeem Warwick had the block shot at the end. And then, Carmelo Anthony, most outstanding player. Syracuse wins the title. And for the first time in my life, still to this day, the only time, I was in a locker room with a team after they had won a championship. And that was fascinating to be in there. At the time, I think I was 29 years old. I wasn't even 30 yet. And so I'm a young guy, and I'm in there, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I remember Bob was in there with his microphone, and we ended up talking to Carmelo Anthony after he won. We ended up talking to a bunch of different players on the teams. But watching some of these players who worked so hard for years, some of them just for, high school into college, like Carmelo, but some of them were juniors and seniors, some assistant coaches that have been in the game forever. And you're in the locker room and just watching this culmination and the celebration. And there's the big trophy right in front. And, they had just come in from cutting the nets down. So the net is on the trophy. I have pictures somewhere of it from my old digital camera that I took. But it's chaos, right? Is my point. And then all of a sudden the SID says, guys, hurry up. Jim Boeheim's got 7 minutes. Let's go. So we run into this closet. We literally weren't even in there because so many people were in there. Coach Boeheim came into this closet with Bob Valvano and myself, and we just went in there. And I think I had some sort of audio recording equipment. I don't remember what it was, maybe a mini disc of sorts, some kind of digital thing. Bobby hits it, and I'm like, we got to get this recording. So I hit it, and thankfully it recorded, because that's your worst nightmare as a producer, is something doesn't record.
Yeah.
It's still my worst nightmare with the podcast,
Yeah.
if something doesn't record. But thankfully it recorded. I took a picture with my digital camera. Again, still have that picture somewhere, of Jim Boeheim being interviewed by Bob Valvano, and we got the interview. But what everybody doesn't realize is all of the chaos and the setups and the pre-planning that is taking place just for that 5 minutes
Right.
with Jim Boeheim after the game. And what was great about that was it was exclusive, right? I mean, Jim did a bunch of interviews, but we were really the only ones that had that one-on-one interview after they won the national championship. He had done press conferences, a couple of group interviews, but we had got the one interview, and we ran it on ESPN radio. And it just felt like, maybe for the first time, this was beginning year 3 for me at ESPN, or maybe even year 4. It just felt like, man, that was amazing. I don't know how we got all of the zigzags to get to that moment, but that was the moment. And when you get that interview, there's just a sense of accomplishment, a sense of just breathing, like, okay, now I can breathe, after all of that. And just this joy that you're doing your job, and you accomplished, for the reason that you were there in New Orleans that weekend, was for that one interview. Of course, we wanted to get other content, but it was for that, and we got it. And so I could go back to Bristol and go back to my bosses and say, this is what we did. And I felt like we had done a good job. But you know this, Brent, behind the scenes, it's chaos.
Yeah.
And it's your responsibility to make sure that interview happens, not Bob Valvano. And so I had to make sure that it was recorded, that we had it, that we ran it. We had to run it back to our offices in New Orleans to make sure it got on air. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But it was so much fun. And I really learned a lot over those first 3 years at ESPN Radio, because I moved on to television after that. But I learned so much about producing, about high energy pressure moments to come through. I know it sounds cliche in sports, but that's how you feel when you're doing, a national radio show in the midst of one of the biggest events of the year.
Yeah. You mentioned your time on the TV side. In your book, you discussed a day in 2010 when you were doing the TV side of things, when Tony Dungy was at ESPN. You were able to spend the entire day with him, kind of guide him around to all of his different show appearances, interviews. You mentioned that he asked you a question that changed your life. That question was, Jason, how do you live out your faith here at ESPN? Can you share more of that story, including what his assistant Jessica said, and how exactly that question changed your life?
Yeah, so I had been a believer since 2001. So I was 27 when I became a Christian, and I don't even know if I could tell you I was honestly a Christian that first year. I said yes to Jesus and began the journey, but I really didn't know what I was saying yes to. Over the next 9 years, I was beginning to learn about who Jesus was, about salvation, the cross, getting involved in church, getting involved in a small group. And I felt like I was in a good place with my faith at that point. Coach Dungy comes, and I'm excited because it's Tony Dungy. Like, you get to spend a day with him, and he's a believer in Jesus, that there's going to hopefully be some really cool God-centered conversations with one of the greatest coaches of all time. And so I was excited. He comes, and then he asked me that question, how do you live your faith out in the workplace at ESPN? And I'd never been asked that question. In fact, I'd never even thought about what that meant in my own faith journey. I thought, because I went to church on Sunday, I was in a Bible study or a small group middle of the week. I try to read my Bible a little bit every day. I don't know if I was fully into devotionals at that point, maybe, but I felt like that was what good Christians do. But when I went to work, I felt like that was work. That wasn't a place where I could live my faith out. I wasn't shying away from being a Christian, but I didn't think that that was even something you could do. In fact, I told him when he asked me that question, I said, Coach Dungy, I don't know if I can even do that here. I can't. How do I live my faith out at ESPN? I don't know if that's possible. I said, I'd probably need to go work for a ministry like Fellowship of Christian Athletes or Athletes in Action or Sports Spectrum or, the NCCAA. I'd have to go to something that's, where the faith is a part of it. And that's where Jessica came in. Coach Dungy, you could just tell, was like kind of disappointed in my answer. And he kind of looked down for a minute, maybe a little shake of the head. And before he could say anything, that's when Jessica, his assistant, came through, kind of stood up and put her hands on her hips and looked at me and just said, "You don't get what Coach Dungy's trying to say here, do you?" I said, "I'm not sure what you're saying, Jessica." I had known Jessica previously, so it wasn't like this brand new person that I had just met 20 minutes ago is doing this. We had a friendship and a work relationship that was, over probably the last 6 months or so was a good one. But she looked at me and she just shook her head and she's like, "You don't get it. You don't understand what Coach is saying here. Look where you work." And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I work at ESPN." She's like, "Right. There's thousands of people here every single day that come into this place. Look at the ministry opportunities that you have to be a light right here at ESPN." And she heard me say that I might have to leave someday if I wanted to do that. She's like, "Maybe God will call you away someday. Maybe he'll take you to a different place. But until he does that, you're to bloom where you're planted right here at ESPN." And what does that look like? Well, that means being a light to all of the people here that you come in contact with and living your faith out. And it was like this light bulb just got really bright above my head, Brandon, and I got it. And I understood what she was saying, what Coach Dungy was saying and asking. And I tell people it changed my life because from that moment, I was able to kind of understand that I was not an ESPN producer who happened to be a Christian. I was a follower of Christ who happened to be an ESPN producer, who happened to be a husband and a dad, who happened to be a suffering Dallas Cowboys fan, if you know where I'm going there. So I am a follower of Christ first. Everything else flows from that. That's why that question from Coach Dungy changed me, because initially I would have told you I was a Christian and maybe that was the first thing in my life, or even my wife or my daughter. But if I'm being 100% honest, my priorities, my wife, my daughter, but my job at ESPN were right there. And my job at ESPN in some ways became the God of my life. I was so focused on doing that. I was so identified with the job that I held there that I began to believe that that's who I was, that I was the ESPN guy. And people called me that. People even in church would call me that. "Hey, there's Jason. He's Mr. ESPN. What's going on, buddy?" Like I was identified with this job that I worked at. And so it took a little while. And thankfully, Coach Dungy was the first to plant that seed with that question. But over the next year or two, I began to see that I needed to understand that my foundation, the center of my life, needed to be grounded in who Christ was and who he says I am to him, which is his son, right? And I am so thankful that that day happened because it changed how I went about my job. It didn't change the job that I did. It didn't change the fact that I wanted to do good work, but it changed my focus. So I didn't make ESPN my God anymore. Christ was Lord of my life and is Lord of my life today. And that's the greatest thing in many ways that could have happened to me in my time at ESPN, was the shift or the pivot in the mindset of my identity being rooted in Jesus and not found in the job that I did.
Sure. Now, in 2017, you did finally answer the call to leave ESPN, pursue sports ministry at Sports Spectrum, where you're still currently at. What was that transition like for you? And what were some of the challenges you faced along the way?
The transition was initially very difficult for a couple of reasons. Number one was even just saying yes to God to leave was hard because from a earthly perspective or a worldly perspective, it didn't make any sense. Not just leaving a very comfortable, well-paying, and enjoyable job working at the biggest sports media company in the world, but it also meant taking a 40% pay cut. It meant working from home and traveling more. It meant no more, benefits. I didn't have health insurance. Thankfully, my wife had a job, so we went on to hers. But all of those things were things that I walked away from at ESPN. And, I don't care who you are. If you're a human being, that's not easy to do.
No.
In fact, maybe most people don't do that. The only reason I knew that it was the right thing to do was because at the time of my life, well, first of all, I believed it was from God. So that's why. That's the ultimate number one. But at 42 years old, which is what I was at that time, or 43, one of those two, I knew that it was time to do something. If I was ever going to do something that included a big move like this, now was the time. Because if I waited until I was 50, which I'll be 50 next year, which is crazy, but if I waited till I was 50, I probably would just stay where I was. It's really hard after 50 years old to start making huge life-changing decisions, right? You're kind of, I don't want to say stuck, but you're kind of in that mode
Right.
that you're set in. So I saw that and I recognized that. And then I said to my wife, which was the biggest, I don't want to call it a barrier, but the biggest hurdle that we had to jump over was making sure my wife was on board with this.
Yeah.
Because it meant, well, how are we going to pay our mortgage?
Yep.
Are we going to be able to still afford to do the things that we've been doing before with 40% less money, right? And I went to her and I said, listen, my wife's a Christian. I said, I've been praying about this and we'll continue to pray, but I believe if this is from God, he's going to make a way. Like he's going to see us through, because that's what his promise is. If we trust him and obey him, he will see us through. He will walk alongside with us. If this is not from God, and this is just some idea that Jason came up with or I came up with on my own, then it'll probably crumble fairly quickly, right in my face. The door will shut and I'll probably be back at ESPN or have to find another job. And I'm still there 5.5 years later. So it didn't, crumble. I do believe it was from the Lord. And I do believe that that was the biggest test in my one of the biggest tests of my entire life, of truly putting my faith and trust that God would take care of whatever we were saying yes to. And I am so grateful that God directed my steps to Sports Spectrum and to this post ESPN journey. I loved my job at ESPN, but I have zero ambition or desire, I think, ever to work there again, not because of anything that they're doing or any experience that I had. It's just I love the work that I get to do now, the purposeful work that I get to do with sharing stories of sports and faith. Now, does that mean I'll never, ever work for a secular organization again? No, that's what God wants. I got to say yes to it. I want to be obedient, but I have no desire to do that at this point, because the work I get to do is so special and different. And, we get to ask questions, Brandon, on the show and the platform of Sports Spectrum that I work at, that we would never ask at ESPN. And yet it's the most important thing in the people that I'm talking to in their lives. It's the most important thing. And I get to ask them about it, and they're never asked about it. Right. And that is their faith. And so I love what we get to do. I'm thankful that we took that leap of faith, if you will. It was not easy, like I said. And even those first 9 months to a year, we're still a little bit of uneasiness. And, did I really make the right decision? God, what's going on here? What are you doing? But he opened up more doors than I ever thought, right? And not just with Sports Spectrum, but I've probably spoken, I don't know, a couple hundred times in the last 5 years to different conferences and churches and, colleges, men's groups, whatever you want to name it, high schools, gatherings about my journey. Some of it's about forgiveness. Some of it's about ESPN. Some of it's about taking a leap of faith. I never desired to be a speaker. I never said, you know what, I'm going to leave ESPN and go speak all around the country. That's not something I didn't want to do that. I'm comfortable with it now, and I'm glad that I get to do it, and I'm thankful I get to do it. But that wasn't in the cards. Certainly writing 2 books was not in the cards. I have zero desire to ever write another book, and I had zero desire to ever write any books.
So we should expect 3 more books in a few years?
I don't know, Brand. I hope that's not God speaking through you, my friend. But I wrote 2 books, and that's great, and I'm glad. And those books are out there, and I hope they help a lot of people, and I know they have helped people. But I don't enjoy writing, and so that's got to be from God, because I didn't want to do these things, and He opened up doors to have not just 1 but 2 books written. So these are the things where I trusted God to lead me through Sports Spectrum, and then all of these different avenues became open, and all of these doors opened up for me to have an opportunity to do things that I never thought. And that's where we are today. And that's kind of why my mind is blown, even talking to you about it, because it's just crazy.
Yeah. You just touched on this a little bit about not expecting or having a desire to really be a speaker or go do anything like that.
Yeah.
At Sports Spectrum, you're the host and producer of the Sports
Yes.
Spectrum podcast, which has over 3 million downloads since it launched.
We're almost at 4 million. I'm
Okay,
excited.
so I'm
Not
a little
there
behind
yet,
on my
but
numbers.
we're almost there. I got to update my website with
Okay,
that, but
there
we're
you
almost
go.
up to 4 million. So we're
So
close.
almost 4 million downloads.
Yeah.
Again, behind the scenes guy, not really wanting to necessarily be the speaker. Have you enjoyed the opportunity to be the host? Has it stretched you, challenged you? How's that been?
Well, it's funny. If you asked 22-year-old Jason when I was still in college graduating, what I'm doing now is exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the guy on air host.
Okay.
I mean, in college, I hosted a sports talk show, which was terrible. And I still have cassettes somewhere if you ever want to listen to it. But I loved the idea of hosting a show. I wanted to be the on air guy. When I got to radio, local radio, and then to ESPN, I realized that wasn't going to happen. But I did have a good skill set and foundation to be a good producer, especially with my knowledge of sports and my ability to learn and adapt. And so that's kind of just the direction I went, was to be a producer. But you always have it in the back of your mind. Hey, could you ever host a show? Could you ever do what these guys that are getting paid millions of dollars to do every day? Could you ever do that? And I kind of gave up on it. But when I talked to my current boss, Steve, when he first called me about the idea of Sports Spectrum, he's the one that said, we want you to host a podcast and launch a podcast. And I told him, you understand, I haven't hosted anything in close to 20 years, like since I was in college. And he said, I understand that, but you produce some of the greatest play-by-play anchors and hosts in the sports industry. You've helped produce guys like Bob Lee and, Chris Berman, Mike and Mike, Jay Harris, like some of these legends, Kevin Nagandi, like you've worked with them. You know what it takes to ask a good question. We think you could do it. And so that was huge, because they gave me the confidence, because I certainly didn't have any, of hosting a show. And if you go back and listen to the first maybe 10 episodes, and thankfully we had some great guests in those first few episodes. So, people like Ernie Johnson and, Matt Hasselbeck and, just amazing people. If you go back and listen to those, to be quite honest, I think I was terrible as a host. I asked questions in a really generic way. I didn't have a good feel for being the host. But those guys are so great at what they did that I think it covered up a lot of blind spots that I had as a host, because they were so good as guests.
If I can jump in,
Yeah.
I'm feeling that exact thing right now with you. So I can resonate with that.
I understand completely, because, what is it? God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the call.
Yeah.
Something like, there's a line like that people use. I certainly felt that way, because I did not feel qualified enough to be able to host a show. If you want me to produce it, I'm all in. But when I host, I was like, is that really what I can do? And I think what I realized over the years, now it's been 5.5 years, and I'm very comfortable, obviously, now hosting a show and asking questions. I think that was always a trait that I've had for many years, was curiosity and being able to be a good listener, which is something I learned from Bob Lee and from Mike Greenberg at ESPN. You know, they had their scripts, their questions, but they also listened. And if the person they were interviewing went somewhere where they weren't completely expecting them to go, they were willing to pivot and go there for a minute because they were good listeners.
Right.
And so that's what I tried to do over the years. It's taken a little time because I'm like you, I have a script and I have questions and I have, you know, topics that I want to cover. But sometimes you realize in a podcast, it's just a conversation and let's just see where it goes. Let's go somewhere else. If that's okay. We'll reel it in if we have to, but let's go somewhere else. And so that's kind of what I've learned. I certainly still don't think that I'm anything special as a host. I just think I've done it for 5 years and interviewed over 1,000 people that, you know, I think when you do that, and what's the Malcolm Gladwell thing? You spend 10,000 hours at something, you know, you become good at it. I think I'm good at it. I don't know if I'm an expert at it, but I love what I get to do. I love the different people that we get to interview. I'm usually somewhat surprised after I do an interview by the story and the depth of some of the people that I have on. There's been a few interviews, I won't name any names, where I'm like not really excited about it, but somebody suggested, and then we talk, and man, their story is incredible. And so I really love hosting just as much as I love producing. But I also understand that there are better hosts than myself. And so we recently just hired a lady named Jade McCarthy to work with Sports Spectrum to do some work with us. Jade was the SportsCenter anchor and NFL Live host for 6 years at ESPN.
Wow.
She was doing what I wanted to do someday. So
Right.
she's clearly ahead of the game as a talent, and she's awesome. And when you watch her and you listen to her do her show now, I recognize that that's why she was at ESPN on the air,
Right.
and I was at ESPN behind the scenes. However, I understand that God has placed me in the position that I'm in to be a host, and I'll do it as long as he wants me to. I do think this too, Brandon, if Sports Spectrum ever ceased to exist or something ever happened where I wasn't the host of Sports Spectrum anymore, I'm fairly confident I would do a show like the one I'm doing with Sports Spectrum, even for free if I had to. I hope it's not for free, but
Right.
you know, because I do love my job.
Yeah.
But I would do it because I love it that much. Because
Yeah.
I love being able to cultivate and create stories with people about their journey of faith in the world of sports. And I hope I can do that as long as God will let me.
Yeah. Now, Sports Spectrum, you've got several podcasts, you've got a magazine. Can you kind of share kind of the plethora of things that Sports Spectrum does and how our listeners can access that content?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's sportspectrum.com is probably the number one place, right? It's our website. And I think when you're there, you'll see a bunch of articles that are updated every day, different stories and testimonials. So it's a regularly updated website, which some websites are not. So this is a place kind of like ESPN that you want to go to each day to just see who the stories are about that day, right? What athletes and coaches are being featured that love Jesus. But then there's devotionals on there Monday through Friday. All of our podcasts can be found there. You mentioned our podcast network of shows. We have 5 shows now. I love all the unique and different aspects of each of our podcasts that we have. And then we have the magazine, which is really the pillar of Sports Spectrum. I mean, if anybody who's listening has heard of Sports Spectrum, they probably go back to like the 80s and the 90s when the magazine was around.
Right.
And a lot of parents of Christian children, or even them being Christian, would get Sports Spectrum as a replacement for Sports Illustrated because they didn't want their kids to get the swimsuit issue,
Right.
which is kind of funny when I think about it. But I totally get it as a dad. And so Sports Spectrum has been around since 1985 with that magazine. And that's something we continue, and we're proud to continue to this day as a quarterly magazine. So every quarter, 4 issues a year, people can subscribe to our magazine. It's the only thing we charge for. And it's super cheap. I think it's $18 for 1 year. It's $30 for 2 years. So for 2 years, you can get it for $15 a year, and you get 4 magazines. In this day and age, it's hard to find something like that. But that magazine just doesn't become something that you keep on your on your tabletop or your coffee table or whatever. It's really become a resource, as we see. In fact, all of what we do are resources to encourage and help others in their walk with Jesus, preferably those that love sports and love Jesus. But it can be an outreach tool. It can be a great way to open a dialogue with someone who's not a Christian and just say, hey, I know you're a fan of, this player. Why don't you check out this story that this company, Sports Spectrum, did about their most important thing in their life? And they might read it, they may not. But what a great way as an evangelistic tool to introduce the gospel to people through the stories that we share. And that's how we approach our jobs. We have a team of about 6 that work on Sports Spectrum, 6 or 7. And all of us go in each day thinking, how can the work that we do today be a potential gateway for someone to hear about the gospel for the first time? And that's what we'll continue to do as long as I'm in charge, and I'm the director of media now. And as long as I'm in the role that I'm in, and as long as my bosses see fit to continue to go in that direction like I do, that's what I see with Sports Spectrum. I see it as an evangelistic opportunity to share the gospel with people through the lens of sports. And we're disguising that in the form of a podcast, in the form of a website and a magazine. But really, it's just a way to share the gospel. And hopefully we can continue to do that.
As director of media, I have a bone to pick with you. I know.
Pick it. I love it.
On your website, at the top, you've got a listing of sports. Now, I'm a big soccer guy. Okay. And there's football, baseball, hockey might be there.
Soccer should be on there.
It is
not on that list.
It is. Well, you have to hover over the more tab. It's not. It's apparently not. It's apparently not big enough to be with the other sports. So that was one thing I noticed. But no,
that's good feedback, Brandon. That's good feedback. Yeah, it's hard to, because you could put everybody's sport is the most important to them, right? Like, we're very connected in the hockey community, the track and field community. So it's very, you're always going to find slack from some people.
I might start a petition to get soccer added.
You get 5 names and we'll change it. There you go. Now, I think it's funny. We want to do more outside of the mainstream sports, although soccer is a mainstream sport, so that's not even said properly. But we want to continue to, it's funny, as Sports Spectrum, it's literally the spectrum of sports, right? So we're trying to do more than just baseball, basketball, football, hockey, add soccer to that, add track and field to that, Olympic sports. I mean, today, as we are recording this, we released an interview on our podcast with a person who is an American Ninja Warrior participant on NBC. Wow. That's sports, and that's faith. So, I mean, we're going outside of the realm of just your typical sports, but to be honest, our ministry is really connected, deeply connected into the world of baseball, football, basketball, hockey. So naturally, we're gravitating towards those interviews because that's who we have connections with in the ministry. But I want to talk to more people in soccer. I want to talk to more Olympians, more American Ninja Warriors. And so, by the way, if anybody's listening and has any suggestions for guests, and you and I have talked about that with some suggestions, please send them my way. I'm not shy to give you my email, jason@sportspectrum.com, and let people just send in some suggestions, or maybe they know someone who knows someone and can connect us. A lot of the guests that we talk to on our shows stem from relationships that other people have that we didn't know about. So we're always open to ideas and ways that we can increase our coverage, including soccer, Brandon.
World Cup starting in November.
I know. Let's go. I'm excited.
I can't wait.
It's going to be good.
I've referenced your book a few times, The Uniform of Leadership. What inspired you to write that? And where can our listeners go to buy it? Which, by the way, I would strongly suggest doing. I haven't finished the book, but what I've read so far, it's so good. It's resonated with me. I've been able to relate. It's good. So,
Thank you. Yeah. So the reason the book exists is because I wanted to create something that had the ESPN stories, because that's what everybody always asks me. Hey, what was it like to work at ESPN? We've done that, right, on the show. But instead of just saying, here's what it was like to work at ESPN, I wanted to write something that people could implement and apply into their life, and not just be some entertaining stories, but be something that we can go a little deeper with and help them grow in their journey. In fact, writing it helped me grow in my journey as a leader. And we're all leaders. It doesn't matter if you're a vice president of a company or if you're the cafeteria cashier, you're a leader, right? Right where you are. And so I wrote the book with my own personal stories, but that's intermingled, as you've read, with the gospel, with who Jesus was as a leader, probably the greatest leader that ever existed, and why serving others is so important and so vital. And so, yeah, I take stories from my time with Drew Brees. I took the Tony Dungy story that I shared here with you. That's chapter 2. I took a lot of, I spent a day with The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, with Will Ferrell, the actor, with all of these different people. I brought those stories into the book, but there's a lot of stories in there as well about people that you haven't heard of, people that I worked with, like Tammy, who was the cashier in the cafeteria, like Carol and Lisa, who were my colleagues, and eventually some of them were my bosses, and great leaders and great friends and people who grew in their faith, great, wonderful people. So I wanted to humanize a little bit of my journey at ESPN too, and not just point to all the celebrities and famous people, but say, hey, you know what, wherever you work, you probably have a Tammy who works in the cafeteria. You probably have a Lisa or Carol that you interact with each and every day that aren't famous or anything, but they're just great people that have helped you grow in your journey. Recognize that. Don't miss that, and understand that you can be a great leader. You can learn from them. They can learn from you. And of course, we wanted the gospel at the center. So we really tried to write it in a way where Jesus was in this book, but where if you're not a believer, you could still read it and be encouraged and maybe see Jesus in a different light. I would also say when we wrote it, we made a decision to write it particularly for groups. So if you're a leader and you lead a team of 10, the book was written for those 10 people to go through together. There's questions at the end of each chapter. The book was written in a way to not just help yourself grow, but go through with a team. If you're a coach and you want to go through it with your players or your fellow coaches, if you're an athletic director and you're looking for a book to go through with your fellow coaches or fellow ADs, that's why we wrote the Uniform of Leadership for those people, for the small groups, for people, anybody, even church leaders who might want to learn how to better their leadership. This was written with those people in mind. So I hope it's come across that way when people have read it. I know a bunch of people that's read it and said they've gone through it with their team and it's really helped them. And the words that you said just mean so much to me after reading it. So I never know if it's really making a difference, Brandon. I mean, I know it's not going to be a New York Times bestseller. At least I don't think it will ever be. But I wrote it for the one person or the couple people that could be encouraged by it. And, hopefully that's what God does with it.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned in the book that it was turned down like, I don't know, 5 times, 6
15
times,
times.
something like that.
No, 15 times.
15 times. Okay. And
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
reading it like, man, like who turned this book down? And I don't know if like
15
edits were
publishers
made,
turned it down.
but man, like
Yes.
it's a good book. Um,
Thank you.
and so is it available on Amazon?
Yeah.
Just
It's
bookstores
available
in
everywhere.
general? Okay.
Yeah, if you go to Amazon, if you go to Books a Million, if you go to Barnes and Noble, wherever you buy books, I guess most people probably buy them at Amazon. It's also
Yeah.
available at my website, which is just my name, jasonromano.com, which is weird to say because I never wanted a website with my name on it. They're like, you kind of have to have one if you're going to write
Right.
books. I said,
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
So we got a website, but yeah, it's available everywhere and it's fairly, I think, easy to find, and it's a fairly easy read
Hmm.
too. I wrote it. You're not going to spend hours trying to get through one chapter.
Right.
I wrote it in a fairly easy and simple way, partially because that's kind of how I am. But it's a quick read that you can go through, but you can also kind of stay in a chapter and spend a week in that and kind of marinate in that a little bit too, and go through those questions. So hopefully it's done in a way that's not too overwhelming for people too.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we've met the end of this conversation. I've really enjoyed our time. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jason, for joining us on King Chasing.
Yeah, you're welcome. Again, I love the title, King Chasing, Brandon. I appreciate you. Big fan of the NCCAA, as you know. We've been talking for a couple years and known each other. So keep doing what you're doing, and always let me know if I can ever help in any way. So thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thanks again to Jason for sharing about his time at ESPN, how Coach Dungy helped change his life, and what he's now doing at Sports Spectrum. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the King Chasing podcast on whatever app you use to listen. We would also appreciate if you encouraged others to listen and subscribe. Once again, we're thankful to you for tuning in and supporting us. Join us next time on King Chasing. Take care, everyone.